Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the first of our two-part series on strategic planning with a DEI focus. We are so thrilled that you are here with us this afternoon, and we look forward to having you join us again for the second session on Tuesday. Before I turn it over to Kuma, I'd like to just go ahead and give a few housekeeping remarks. We are expecting a large number of participants today, so we have everyone muted, and you do not have the option of unmuting your audio. So when we get to the Q&A portions of our presentation today, please feel free to either put your questions into the chat box or to go ahead and use the raise your hand function, and one of us will unmute you so that you can ask your question. We are recording today's session, so if you have to drop off early or you'd like to send the recording to a colleague, you will have access to that. It will be posted on the ACCE webinar page, so you'll be able to find this session here. I wanted to also mention that if you're planning on attending the second part of this two-part series, you do need to make sure that you have registered for that session separately. So if you haven't done that already, please go to the ACCE website and you can go ahead and register for the second part of this series. So with those housekeeping items out of the way, I'd like to go ahead and introduce today's presenter. We are so thrilled to welcome Kuma Roberts for this two-part series. Kuma is an IOM and is the Senior Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Consultant for Arrowhead Consulting and has over 10 years of organizational development experience, specializing in the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion, cultural competence, implicit bias, strategies for becoming an equity-centered organization, inclusive workplace language, as well as other dimensions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. As a graduate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Institute of Organizational Management, she has spoken to hundreds of businesses, nonprofit, and chambers of commerce on the best practices for developing a strategic plan related to DEI. Kuma is passionate about racial and social justice with emphasis on shifting policies and practices versus hearts and minds, and speaking to how more companies and organizations can harness the power of DEI to enhance their competitive advantage. When Kuma isn't speaking, she loves cooking for her husband, wrestling with her 3-year-old son, and arguing with her 16-year-old daughter. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Kuma.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. And thank you all for joining today. I can't tell you how excited I am to present to you all because this feels like home. I've been presenting all week at a variety of different places, but when I'm talking to my chamber family, this is what I'm used to, and I love to do this work. So please use your chat. I'm going to be talking through some level setting information today, some ways for us to start thinking that we can build our equity strategies. And so as you are listening to what I have to say, I'd love to know your thoughts or maybe some issues happening within your own chamber. And then please note that I will be building on this next week, and we'll move into actually what that framework and what the strategy will look like. So really, I would like to see you all back. Let me just share a little bit about how we'll spend our time together for the next hour or so. Here, I'll talk a little bit more about myself. I'll tell you a little bit about my diversity story. We'll talk about the value of shared language and why I think shared language is so important in terms of doing this work around equity and making it an economic imperative for your organization. We're going to discuss some of the cold, hard facts about nonprofits and other organizations like chambers as it results to doing this work. Then we're going to really define equity and get into it as the economic imperative and the value of that to your organization. We'll talk through the cultural competence continuum, as well as the diversity, equity, and inclusion maturity matrix, which is really important and will showcase sort of the steps necessary for your organization to take in order to really build a really strong equity strategy. And then I'll share a little bit of the lessons learned through my time at the Tulsa Regional Chamber, where I was formerly the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So with that being said, let me tell you a little bit about myself. myself. This is my family. I like to introduce myself by saying that I am diversity personified. I am a 40-something working mother, married to Floyd Roberts, my husband. We've been married for 6 years. We've got a 33-year age difference between us. We're raising my daughter from another marriage. She's 16. And together, he and I have Ezekiel, or Prince Roberts, as we say, our son, Ezekiel. I am the daughter of an African immigrant. He came to this country to go to college, where he met my mother, who was a strong Southern Baptist. I've been married and divorced and married again. I was a single mom for a time. Again, I'm in the working world. My husband has the home duties. And so I like to give that definition of myself and that introduction of myself, because I have a lot of elements of diversity, equity, inclusion that define me, that is not just about my race or being female. There's a lot of other things that make up who I am. And as we are talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and something I always encourage the Tulsa Regional Chamber to do is never to discount themselves from the conversation around DEI. It's so important. Don't say, I don't have that background. I don't have any challenges that I've had to overcome. There's nothing that separates me. I'm not different. You don't have to say that way. You don't have to have, a race or a gender barrier in order to count yourself a part of these conversations. So I am diversity personified, and so are you. So please, no excuses. We need everyone to be a part of leading this work. And certainly in the chamber world, we need every voice we can get to do this. Let me tell you a little bit about Arrowhead Consulting. I'm really excited to have joined the Arrowhead team. It's a small organizational development and management consulting firm based here in Oklahoma. And we have resources here that have over 180 combined years of private and public sector experience. Our mission here is to guide companies through the process of strategic change. We support strategic and tactical responses to challenges and opportunities posed by technology, by cultural change, by business and financial constraints. So this is my new home. I encourage you, if you are interested in building your D&I strategy or have questions or thoughts about some of the strategies you've already built into your program, please reach out. I would love to chat with you. That being said, I want to go ahead and move into a quick little activity that I love to do, and it's called How Diverse is Your Universe? Now, how diverse is your universe is something I typically would do when we're in person. I would bring all these kinds of beads, I'd set them out in front of you, and I'd give you all a pipe cleaner, and I'd ask you a bunch of questions and ask you to sort of thread that pipe cleaner based on the amount of racial and ethnic diversity you have in your universe, right? So I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions, and what I'm asking you to do is just jot it down. You don't have to do anything fancy. Just as you're jotting it down, if I ask a question about what is your racial or ethnic identity, just put, for me, I've given an example there, it's Black and it's female. And so you can just do the same. And the idea is by the end of it, you're going to see, hopefully, how diverse your universe is or not as diverse. And this really helps us as we begin to think about conversations around infusing equity into our chamber strategies. So given that, I can't hear from many of you, I'm going to go ahead and assume that we're ready. And I'm going to begin to ask the first question. And the first question was what I already said. Go ahead and jot down the race or ethnicity that closely represents your own. Again, if you're white, go ahead and put W, and then go ahead and put male if you're male and female if you're female. I like also to think about gender as we talk about diversity as well. So that's why I want you to do the male and female. The next question is, go ahead and jot down the racial or ethnic identity of your significant other. What about that, the race and ethnicity of your closest friend? What about those people that whom you worship most predominantly? If you go to a church, or if you don't have a church home, that's fine. You don't have to jot anything down, but just think about those who you spend your time with on the weekends and in a place of worship, if you do. What about the neighbors on either side of your home? Race, ethnicity, and gender. How about your doctor? Your dentist? Your attorney, a lawyer you might have? What about your boss, the person you report to? Or your board, most predominantly? Who are they? What about your children's teachers? And if you don't have kids, what about the teachers you had when you were growing up? Race, ethnicity, and gender. What about your coworkers? Most predominantly, race, ethnicity, and gender. The people in your social circle, most predominantly, are what? How about the author of the last book that you read? What about the last good movie you saw? Who were the people in it most predominantly by race, ethnicity, and gender? During the course of your day, who are the people you come most in contact with most predominantly? And then lastly, the person you most admire or who's had the greatest impact on your life, race, ethnicity, and gender, who is that person? Now I'm going to ask you all a question. How diverse is your universe? I think it would be great if in the chat you could write, yep, got a lot of diversity, this was pointless, or wow, I really see that I have a very small bubble of individuals in my circle. And that's ultimately what we all find. I find that when I do the same thing, I honestly don't have a ton of diversity in my own universe. And I have to be very intentional about going out to seek it. So I ask you, fellow Chamberites, if you have little or no interaction with people outside of your group, how will that affect your ability to be more diverse and to reach into more diverse audiences as you try to build your diversity strategy or your inclusion strategy? Do you ever stop to think about how you actually would even begin to communicate with people outside of your universe, right? How do you even start? Do you consider, or did you before this consider yourself someone who had a wide circle of influence with a very diverse group of friends? And how wrong were you when you think about that? The whole point of this is if you have little to no exposure to others, how much of an impact do you think you can make as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion? I love this exercise because it really illuminates the work that we all have to do in order to really further and embed this work in our own organizations. So this picture is an actual picture of a chamber that I used to work for. No, I'm just joking. It's not exactly a picture, but I would find that when I'd go out and talk to people about what they think of chambers of commerce, this was what would come to mind when they'd be thinking about who made up a chamber of commerce. But perception was reality in many cases for people. And a flashpoint happened in Tulsa a few years ago when there was an article that swept through our community. It was called How America's Heartland is Losing Its Black People. It was featured in The Guardian online, and it had been written by a Tulsan and an African-American male. And in it, he cites why he left Tulsa and Oklahoma, and specifically, he talked about our chamber. He talked about our board of directors. He talked about our steering committees and the publications and images and of those in power on those committees and how no one looked like him when he saw those images. And honestly, he asked the question, how could we care about underrepresented populations if no one was representing him within our organization? Somehow, despite our very best efforts, the Tulsa Regional Chamber had missed something. And what I realized was that thing was the equity. So when we look at this iceberg, this is how we believe as chambers, as organizations, how we are getting our business done, everything above that iceberg. We've got a vision, we have a strategy, we have shared values, goals, policies, structures, procedures, all of these things, right? We talk about them, are a part of our vernacular. It's just embedded in our chamber to use phrases like that. It's the way we say we get work done. But really, what has a huger impact on our work is what happens underneath the iceberg. It's those beliefs, those shared assumptions, perceptions, traditions, norms, values, unwritten rules, right? That are all under the surface, the stories and the feelings about your organization in the community that make up the way you really get things done. And part of the work that I want to talk to you all about is how do we begin to sort of expose a little bit more of that iceberg so that we can dig a little bit deeper and really start to head on attack some of those beliefs, tradition, shared values, perceptions, so that we can truly get to doing the important work of furthering diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I use this because I believe that if we aren't clear on the words and ideas, how can we be clear on the solution? So there's a value to shared language. And much of what I found with my work in chambers of commerce is that there isn't a common shared language. Everyone defines diversity differently. Some will say, well, it's diversity of thought. We have a lot of diversity. It's or people nail diversity, but they don't quite really understand what inclusion means. Or they've got the diversity and inclusion, but they miss equity. So I really think that as we're talking today, I want to create some shared language across all of us so that as we continue to next week build on these concepts and you try to further these concepts within your own organization, that at least we know that we're all talking and starting from the very same place. And I use this incredible Venn diagram, which I think is really, really good when it talks about diversity, equity, inclusion. So this says inclusion is at the top. Inclusion is at the top, where thoughts and ideas and perspectives of all individuals matter. Then we have diversity, where multiple identities are represented in an organization. And then we have equity. And equity is the constant and consistent recognizing and redistribution of power. And we will get into that a lot more because that is really the topic of what I want to talk to you all about. But right in the center of this Venn diagram, this is the sweet spot. This is the sort of the end result we're all hoping for, is for belonging. We want an organization that engages full potential of an individual, where innovation thrives and where views and beliefs and values are integrated. That is what we're all hoping for. A lot of organizations are switching to a DEIB language when they're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So we just keep adding letters and we'll eventually get there at some point. But what I love about this diagram is it talks about what it looks like when you've got one or not the other, and there's just something missing. And I think sometimes we operate of where the dominant group or the ideology deferred to is for decision-making, opportunities, and promotions. So we only kind of ask for outside perspective, when it's about Black History Month, or we ask for input or collaboration when it's about Native American history or Latinx week or whatever. But we're not really trying to integrate those different thoughts and perspectives across our strategy, our strategic plan. So that's what happens when you have inclusion and diversity, but maybe not equity. Then on the other side, you get an oversaturation of similarity and homogeneous culture and simplified viewpoints when you have inclusion and a little bit of equity. So there's some, again, you're missing that diversity, that addition of flavor, if you will, to the whole conversation. And then underneath here, when you don't have inclusion, you get culture assimilation, which results in disengagement, low self-esteem, a lot of turnover, lack of retention. There's a lot of things that sort of express that you don't have an inclusive culture. And so we can talk a little bit about that. But I use this as a way to establish some shared language for everyone that I'm talking to so that we understand that when I say diversity, equity, inclusion, this is what I mean. And I always talk about race extensively because I'm a Black woman and that's something that's sort of, a part of who I am. But I talk about race extensively, but not exclusively. There are a lot of other elements related to diversity, equity, and inclusion that are really important to your organization. And sometimes a smaller chamber, maybe you don't have or live in a community where there's a ton of diversity. Tulsa, Oklahoma, perhaps is just about 12% African American versus a Memphis or, one of the Carolina chambers that might might have a larger percentage of African Americans. So we have to lean in on other elements of diversity and make that story. And so I'm going to read through these facts because I think these are really important to think about as you are engaging and trying to energize your own equity strategies around diversity, equity, inclusion. So as I said, I talk about race extensively, but not exclusively. Race is a part of it. And by 2065, only 46% of the population will be white. 46%. There will be no racial or ethnic group majority. So if you think about that and you think about your strategy and you've been operating with a very homogenous group, not a lot of diversity or inclusion, you will be out of the loop because the demographics of our country are changing. So you have to really consider that there's not going to be a majority by 2065 and how important that will be to how you craft and construct your strategy. I love this one on ability. Someone told me once that it's the only minority group any one of us could join at any time. And I think that's a really powerful thing to think about. 1 out of 4 American adults identify as having a disability. Are you thinking about disability as an element of diversity, equity, inclusion for your organization? Are you thinking about ADA compliance? Are you thinking about accessibility? I have my subtitles running as I'm speaking today for those who might be hearing impaired. There's a lot of things your chamber can do that are easy, quick wins to address ability and potentially making that a stronger element of your diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. Then, of course, we have age. Millennials have overtaken the workplace. I can't say that enough. They're coming. They're in here on us. And I used to think millennials were these tiny babies who were just coming up behind me. Millennials are almost 40. They are in the workplace and they've overtaken the baby boomers as the largest generation in the workplace. Are you considering your millennials as part of your strategy? Do you have a young professionals organization? Are you engaging them fully into how you build your work around diversity, equity, and inclusion? That will be really important. Veterans are often overlooked as well. In 2016, 7% of American adults were veterans who have a variety of transferable skills and who are often highly qualified, have a great work ethic, should definitely be a part of your diversity strategy. Are you a veteran-friendly workplace? Are you engaging and thinking about how to make easy their transfer from service into your workplace? Because I assure you, they've got the skills and the training, but we're not looking at them as a potential jackpot of really highly qualified talent when it relates to DEI. And then, of course, we have the LGBTQ+. So an estimated 3 to 5% of Americans identify as LGBTQ+. And that is a pretty staggering number, and it's only growing. More and more people are connected to that. And when they look at your website, when they look at your diversity statement, when you're looking at events and all of these things, they want to see clues that you understand what it means to be transgender. Are you still sticking to Mr. and Mrs. as a typical way to identify yourself at meetings or on documents, membership documents? All of those things are signaling to that group whether you are open and affirming and diverse and inclusive. And so you have to think about that population as you do this work. And then lastly, for Tulsa, this is a really huge one, the refugee and immigrant community. Our population here in Tulsa has skyrocketed, like 123% over the past 3 years. And so 13.5% of the American population is foreign born, and beginning by 2030, which is right around the corner, migration will be the primary driver of population growth. So that population here in Tulsa, we have a huge number of Hmong and Burmese, and certainly our Latinx population is growing. Translation is important. How are you reaching into their community? How are you onboarding that community in terms of your strategies, or how are employers thinking about this? This is all really important stuff to think about and can be a really critical part of your diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So again, race extensively, but not exclusively. So I want to share a couple of cold, hard facts, because I think when we think about these facts, it talks about a little bit of the mountain we have in front of us as we do this work. The first one is over 80% of nonprofit staff, and dare I say chamber staff, leverage personal and professional networks, which are consistently ranked as the most popular and most effective recruitment channels. So we just talked about how diverse our universe is, or how lacking in diversity our universes are. And I'm telling you that 80% of organizations and nonprofits leverage that network in order to find recruitment. That's a shame. You're missing out on a large population of individuals if you would just expand your own group of people that you have working with you. 75% of white Americans have social networks without any minority presence. That's not a teacher. That's not anyone you encounter. That's not anyone you come in contact with. And when I say minority, I'm not saying just Black, I'm saying across all of those elements of difference. How many millennials, how many refugees or immigrants, how many veterans, how many LGBTQ people do you have in your universe? You could play that game, not just about race and gender, but you could play it across a variety of elements of diversity. I think these are really staggering. In a controlled study of job openings in a university setting, white participants recommended the Black candidate significantly less often than the white candidate with exactly the same credentials. So there's oftentimes an unconscious bias going on, right? We kind of pick who we connect with, who we find commonalities with. And if we don't have a ton of that diversity within our circles, we are just picking people that are more and more like us. And ultimately, we don't get that diversity. And then again, in a controlled study of job openings across industries, applicants with white sounding names are 50% more likely to get an interview than those with African-American sounding names. So again, there's these slight biases that we have in our head that we don't even think about that can impact how much diversity we get in our organization. At the Tulsa Regional Chamber, we instituted blind hiring. We took off the name. We took off where you go to college, because sometimes that can be a factor in triggering our unconscious bias. Oh, you went to Oklahoma State? Oh, I want to meet that guy, versus Drury University, which just happened to be where I went. So there's a lot of these elements at play, but those facts are pretty staggering. And you have to think about what those facts are for your own community. Tulsa has its own staggering group of facts. And I won't share those with you, but I'll just say these are at play in every nonprofit and certainly at play within our chambers as we continue to do this work. So equity is defined as the state or quality or ideal of being just, impartial, or fair. The concept of equity is synonymous with fairness and justice, and it's helpful to think of equity not simply as a desired state of affairs or a lofty value. We have to think about it that in order to it to be achieved and sustained, equity has to be a part of a systemic and structural element of our organizations. And so I love this quote that equity is truth in action. Many of our organizations have core values. We say we get diversity, we want to be inclusive, but equity is the proof in the pudding in my mind. It really is all about demonstrating what you say your organization is about. At the Chamber a few years ago, we had been celebrating diversity, and Mosaic, which was the outward-facing coalition of corporate and nonprofit partners, we'd been cultivating inclusion with our Mosaic group, but no one at the time was championing equity as much. And so the facts that were cold and hard, we couldn't be ignored if we wanted to remain relevant in the chamber world and in our own community. We had to address equity because we wanted to stay at the forefront of diversity, equity, and inclusion leadership. So equity is aspirational. And I want to just take a little bit of time to dig a little bit deeper into equity. Equity means that you get improved conditions and outcomes for marginalized people and in those communities, which think about economic development, think about education, think about so many of the core pieces of what make up the work of our work at a chamber. Equity increases the power to determine and sustain those improvements. And it ultimately means greater integration, interaction, and interdependence across a variety of identities. And so equity truly, in my mind, is the vehicle that we use to get to equality, right? When we talk about equity versus equality, equality is the end result. All men are created equal. All people are created equal. How do we get there? Equity. It's addressing the systemic and the the rooted issues around systems and why they are the way they are. Equity is also operational in the sense that it's about interrupting inequitable practices, examining biases, and creating an exclusive environment for all individuals, especially those who've been historically marginalized. And that's just not, again, by race. All of those different elements that I mentioned earlier have been historically marginalized. It's a proactive approach to making systems work more fairly to produce results that people can actually feel in their lives. That is what equity is. So I still get, why is it so hard to understand? And I got a real lesson in it here in Tulsa when I used to work in education at the chamber, and I went to a school and I said, what are your needs at the school? And the teacher said, look, we need hats and gloves. Our students come from, challenging backgrounds. A lot of poverty exists in our school. And I said, oh my gosh, then we just need to do a hats and glove drive for the students. And she said, that would be great, but ultimately we need hats and gloves for the students that need it. Not every kid needs it. I'd like you to be more intentional about who you're serving with your drive. And I thought, oh my gosh. And so this illustration, I think maybe some of you have seen the boxes with all the kids kind of standing, looking over the boxes in their different heights, as an explanation of equity. But to me, equity is providing the right tools to the right people when they need it so they can be successful. So I love this imagery about this really tall guy who's on a standard bike that's not getting him anywhere fast. What he needs is something that's adapted specifically for him so that he can move forward in order to meet his goal, finish the race, however you want to consider it. So this is ideally what equity looks like. And you can see what equality looks like in relation to it. Equality, everyone is given the same thing, right? But equity, people are given the right tool in order to do the thing that gets them the most success. That's what we're trying to do with our work in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I love this really great quote. An equitable society would be one in which the distribution of benefits and burdens is not determined, predictable, or disproportionate by identity or place. That is what we want, an equitable society, which hopefully results in more equality. So let's talk a little bit about the cultural competence continuum. The cultural competence continuum is one of the tools that I use to really sort of start people thinking about equity and being a more equitable organization. So in the red, we have cultural destructiveness, and that's forced assimilation. That's where rights and privileges are for the dominant group only. I can tell you I've done this a million times, and no one's ever said or wanted to say that I've heard that's where they're operating from in terms of their personal belief system and or their organization. But we know that exists. We know those organizations and employers in our community that are operating from the red. And so we have to name that, and that's called cultural destructiveness. Then there's cultural incapacity, where there's racism, where stereotypes are maintained, where maybe women are, there's not gender parity, there's some unfair hiring practices or maybe biased hiring practices at play, and a lot of people are operating from incapacity. And then we move into blindness. And blindness is so interesting to me because that's where a lot of people are operating from, where differences are ultimately ignored. And we have this sort of, I just treat everyone the same mentality, and which only ultimately serves the dominant group. I did this presentation to a group of CEOs here in Tulsa a few years ago and asked them personally where they were on the continuum. And the room was dead silent. I didn't expect anyone to answer. But one really brave leader of a healthcare organization raised her hand, and she said, I operate out of blindness. I really feel like I just want to treat everyone the same. We're all human. I don't see your color, Kuma. I don't know. It doesn't impact anything for me other than I know that you're a good person and I like you. And so I didn't realize that the continuum extended beyond that, right? I think people think that that's where we're all trying to get to. And I would say that that's not where we're trying to get to. What we want to do is we want to get to pre-competence, where you're starting to explore cultural issues. You're committed to assessing the needs of your organization and the individuals that you're serving. You can move into cultural competence, where you're recognizing individual and cultural differences, and you're starting to really seek advice from diverse groups, and you're starting to hire culturally unbiased staff. And that's a really good one because, like I said, in Tulsa, there's not a ton of African Americans in the community. We don't have a large population of them. So what I always said was, I might not be able to diversify our staff by 50% to showcase racial, diversity, but I can make sure that everyone we hire has implicit bias training. They can understand cultural competence. Our board can be aware of it. And so that at the very least, if you don't see the visible diversity, people at least have a mindset, or they understand the concepts of what it means to have that and try to work toward that. And then lastly, we have cultural proficiency, which in my mind, if we think about the iceberg, is where we are, what we're saying we do business and how we're saying we do business is really and truly how we do our business. And there's really nothing under the iceberg. You're starting to implement changes to improve services based upon cultural needs. So I'm going to take a second and just ask you all to think about this, and certainly use your chat liberally. Don't forget, where are you personally on the cultural continuum? And be honest about that, because when you can sort of assess where you are, it will be really helpful in how you move forward and trying to educate yourself, make yourself more aware, and hopefully helping to move your organization forward. So after you think about you, think about your chamber, think about your organization. Where does it fall on the cultural competence continuum? Where have you been operating from most predominantly? Is it in incapacity? Are you thinking about unconscious bias? Are there stereotypes potentially that are being maintained that you haven't addressed? Maybe women versus men. Do you have a lot of women on your leadership teams? These are some things to think about. Or are you operating out of blindness? And then think about, where is your city, right? Because that has a lot to do with this. Where is your city? What are the city dynamics? Tulsa had a race massacre 100 years ago, where a very prosperous African-American community was literally burned to the ground. And there's been a loss of that. There's been a skeptical feeling in the African-American community here in Tulsa as it relates to that. And so, what's your community story? How is it feeding into the perceptions and the thoughts about your chamber? How do you begin to tackle some of that and move into proficiency? It'd be really important to think about that. So we use the cultural competence continuum to think about our own personal, as well as our organizational beliefs. But this graph really, I think, talks from an organizational level what we should be striving for. Many organizations are operating in basic. And basic is where D&I is on the agenda for discussion, but no concrete plans are in place to define or achieve a desired outcome beyond those about regulation. So that's when someone's just operating on D&I for compliance reasons. You're just, well, we should probably have a diverse board. You're tokenizing, you're picking one person, you've got one Black person on staff. You are just sort of like, yep, we've achieved it. That's where a lot of organizations are operating. What we need more people to do is move into awareness, where diversity is increasingly recognized as a business benefit and inclusive culture is acknowledged as a key to success. I'm so sorry, I keep choking up here. Forgive me. And then we move into awareness and application. And this is where it gets really good. It's where management starts to recognize the business benefit of diversity and can demonstrate that it's implementing D&I strategies designed to be more inclusive. And so that's like mandatory training with your managers. That's like creating evaluations around diversity, equity, inclusion, and how inclusive teams are, or how they're demonstrating inclusive behaviors. That's where it's in order to be promoted, you're really implementing some of that. It's like a business benefit. You truly embrace the business case for D&I. And then I'm just realizing that my two graphs are not correct, but integrated is where you are beginning to implement changes. And it's really like a part of the conversation that you have as you're discussing strategy and you're trying to move your organization forward. You're integrating D&I across every element, from hiring to recruitment to onboarding to development to training, all of that. And then ultimately you move into sustainability, where it becomes how business is actually done. And that's really the point we all want to get to as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So think about that. And let me tell you some of the lessons learned through our work here at the Tulsa Regional Chamber. Leadership is everything. One of the core pillars of the work of Mosaic was CEO and owner buy-in. Every conversation that I had, I was put in front of the board more often than ever before, because the chamber really bought into the fact that if I can be in front of leaders, our board members, and talk to them about diversity and inclusion, then we're demonstrating our commitment to that, and then they will understand, and that can trickle down into their own organization. There's nothing that I could have done without the help of Mike Neal over at the Tulsa Regional Chamber and Justin McLaughlin, who truly believed that leadership was important to move this forward, and they were my champions for it. So I ask you, who are your champions for diversity, equity, inclusion within your organization? And if you don't have one, you got to get one. The past 3 board chairs for the Tulsa Regional Chamber have included diversity, equity, inclusion as a top priority for their agendas every time they come on. It's now an expectation that if you're going to lead our chamber, then you're going to have one priority that relates to D&I and how to move that forward within our organization. And this year we have our first African-American female board chair, and I'm so excited about that. And so think about leadership and the value it plays in an organization, and begin to use your chamber to reach into your CEOs, your business, your community leaders, to embed this within them and try to move this forward. The next one is accountability. I think, we really had to think about being accountable to what happened in Tulsa, potentially the role our chamber might have played 100 years ago with the massacre. How do we become accountable today? What is required of us in order to name what we can do? So we believed that we can impact economic access and mobility for communities of color. That was something that we named as a strategic plan in our strategic plan. And so we really started to embed some very direct things to hold us accountable to how we were responding to the fact that we say we want diversity, equity, inclusion to be a part of our organization. What is that for you? How can your organization be accountable to the communities you serve, to all of those different elements across difference? We need you to think about accountability. And then be bold, do what the ordinary fear. This statement was really about the fact that as we were embracing and starting to think about what happened in Tulsa 100 years ago and how we wanted to be different and how we wanted our chamber to be leading this, there is literally a highway that divides North Tulsa from South Tulsa here in Tulsa. And it's not uncommon across the nation. Urban renewal came through and built highways and divided our communities like that. And so we know our situation wasn't new or different from anyone else across the community, but how can we symbolically tear down that wall of that highway? And so one of our white staff members, I'll never forget it, he said, why don't we try to tear down that highway and try to get it rerouted and think about using the Urban Land Institute to help us to figure it out? And I could have shed tears. I was so excited, number one, because I, as a person of color, didn't have to think about it. But number two, what a powerful way to help better connect our communities again from what it used to be. And that's a bold multi-billion-dollar commitment to try to figure that out. But our chamber did go ahead and reach out to the Oklahoma Department of Transportation. We did convene meetings and continue to have meetings to discuss what this could look like for our community, both symbolically and in a real way, how to connect our community again. And then destination unknown. And I love this slide because what we had was, when we started this work a few years ago, we had our community and our community leaders, and even sometimes our CEO saying, when we get to 2021, we will wow, we're going to really be so much farther off with regards to equity, and we're really going to have this figured out. And boy, it's going to be great when we get there. And I kept saying, whoa, 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 whoa. Things are not going to be perfect just because we've done, these few steps. We've made a few steps toward equity within our organization. There's a lot more work to do. It has taken over 400 years to wind and create systems of oppression across our entire society, and they can't be unwound, certainly by one chamber, in the span of just a few years. So I caution you from saying, when we get there, this one point of when you would have arrived at the place of really having gotten and understood diversity inclusion. No, the journey is ongoing. There will be the next thing that you have to do when you get there. So embrace not knowing where that final destination is, but know that there are small things you can do along the way to help get you further along so you can begin to track your progress in that respect. And then let's see. I love this quote. It is a quote by Lila Watson. She is an Aboriginal advocate in Australia. And she says this quote, and I've been using it all the time because I just think it's so powerful. She says, "If you've come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up in mine, then let us work together." And I love this quote because oftentimes the approach our chambers take is, we're there to help. I want to help you. I just want to partner with you and help bring you up a little bit and kind of get you on your way. And that is the wrong approach for us to take as we think about equity and building equity into our strategies. What we have to believe is that our liberation, our relevance, our success is bound up with those communities across difference. And if we come with that approach, then certainly we can work together with them. They will be more willing to work together with you in order to advance equity within your organization. The next time I come together with you all, next Tuesday, I'm going to get really specific. I'm using a pro-inspire model called Awake to Woke to Work. It's out there. You can Google it. It is a framework that I have found really gets to the heart of different levers that we can all shift within our organization in order to move toward being more equity centered. There is a leadership lever. There is a community lever. There's a board lever. There's a data lever. And there's, I believe, an outreach lever. So there's a lot of things we'll talk about moving forward. But with that, I will stop and say that that is my presentation. Here's my information if you want to reach out to me between now and next time. And hoping the chat is just jam-packed, Amy, with a lot of great questions. So let's talk.
Absolutely. So I will start by saying I appreciate some people's candor in saying that this feels a little overwhelming and they're just sort of getting started with some of this work. Sure. Do you have any suggestions for folks who are maybe on the earlier stages of this, a few Sure. starting steps or some initial actions that they could do or steps they could take?
Absolutely. The first thing you can do is educate and make yourself more aware. And that was honestly the first step of what we did at the chamber. So we had Mosaic, which was created in 2011. Mosaic was the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Council. It was as a member of the chamber, you were a member of Mosaic, and we had monthly meetings where we'd talk about women in the workplace. We'd talk about racial equity. We would just have a speaker or someone come in and talk. And so that to me is an easy first step. Do you understand racial equity? Do you understand the needs of the LGBTQ plus community? Find someone in that community, partner with them, bring them in, and let them talk to your board. You educate your leadership team. You go and educate yourself. There's just this level of just understanding that would be a great first step. And it's a quick win, because when you can use the language, talk about it, then you will begin to see the need of how it can then play into your organization. I recognize that not every chamber has 85 employees or 72 is how we had, but I do believe that everyone can educate themselves, and it would be really key to moving this work forward in your organization. Any other questions? I'm trying to look at chat, but I can't see, so I'll let you handle it, Amy.
So please feel free. And also just a reminder for folks, you can either drop those questions into the chat, or if you want to raise your hand because you have maybe a more complicated question you'd like to ask, feel free to do that and we can unmute you as well. Those were the primary questions that have come in so far, but I do see that we have a question from Marilyn. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, Marilyn. You should be able to say yes.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. This has been really so fabulous, and it's come at a good time. We've been trying for the past couple years. The way that I put it to my leadership and my membership committee, we come from a very diverse community. My chamber doesn't look like my community, and my board doesn't look like my membership. And so there's just a great divide if you look at my board and you look at my community. But we've been trying for the past couple years to both, from a leadership perspective, to have more diversity, and from our but more importantly, from a membership perspective. And we're a small chamber, 400. We have a staff of 3. We have had diversity on our staff. We currently don't at the time right now. So we're just not getting results. So any words of wisdom? Thank you.
Yeah. So when you say results, you're talking about the diversity of your membership. You're struggling in that realm. Do you happen to know the diversity stats for your community? I mean, you said it. Your board doesn't look like your community.
Yeah. So our community, there's no majority in our community. We're we're probably 30% Hispanic, 20% African American, another 10% Asian. Yeah. So it's a very diverse community. Right. We've been around for 70 years. Our community has changed in that time, but we haven't.
Yeah. I would say that certainly in the Latinx community, what I've found is relationships are everything, right? And you can't just pop on the scene and make an invitation and expect that you're going to have a lasting or trust-building relationship with that community. So showing up, being consistent, engaging with them more, going to their celebrations, their, making connections, building relationships, their businesses, supporting their businesses. Here we have Supermercado Morelos, and Francisco's fantastic. And I don't even think he speaks English, but he's present, and we try to support him in his endeavor and in his community. So I would suggest doing more of that. Where are you having your meetings? Are you going to the Hispanic community? Are you going to African American community? Are you going to the local equality center, which is where we have our LGBTQ plus? I mean, there are just ways to insert your organization into difference in order to make them more aware of you, and vice versa, you become more aware there. That can go a long way into helping to infuse more diversity into your organization. You might even find a new business to join you, right? A new Mexican restaurant or someone who's doing something that would be a great ad. Thank you for the question.
So Kuma, we get this question a lot, and I'm curious what resources you might have to offer. So Cheryl says it'd be useful to have an assessment metric for the organization and its different programs to serve as a starting point for charting change. And throughout a lot of the programs that ACCE offers, this concept of how do you measure and evaluate progress in DEI comes up a lot. Do you have any recommendations for resources or an assessment or anything like that that you could point folks to?
Yeah, so at Mosaic, I didn't create it, but we called it the Mosaic Index. And the Mosaic Index was our regional snapshot, if you will. We asked employers to take it. We had an open period, and it's on the internet. You can just, Google it. Past questions are there. And it provides a starting place for our chamber to understand what are the needs of the community as it relates to D&I, and then beginning to formulate how we will deliver that resource to the community and to our employers. So for instance, it'll say, do you have CEO buy-in? At what level is that buy-in? Has there been an op-ed written in your local paper about diversity and the impact of it on the business community? Like, it kind of like walks you through some really initial sort of benchmarking things that should be in place. Do you have a diversity statement? Do you mention diversity in your mission and vision and value statement? So those are just some of the things. I know it sounds overwhelming. These are things you should already have in place as a chamber. You probably already do. You're just trying to make sure that you are lifting up and elevating the concepts of, and let's just say, inclusion, right? It's hard to say DEI into every piece, but even to be more inclusive, you're going to want to make sure that there's a nod to inclusion across every little piece of your organization. You don't have to start over, but you want to start infusing that. So maybe look at the Mosaic Index, look at those questions, take it yourself, just assess where you stand. And then certainly, I believe there's some other resources out there. I wish I could cite one. There's lots of different tools. PricewaterhouseCoopers has a really good one that you can take, and I think they'll give you back a report. PricewaterhouseCoopers has the CEO Action Network, which has a ton of resources for chambers and for businesses who are looking to do more of this work. And so they have a community pledge available, lots of things you can kind of R&D and rip off and duplicate, and maybe think about tailoring it to your community. And I'm not ashamed to do that, and have in the past with some of my chamber efforts.
Great, thank you for that. So our next question is around attracting and developing minority leaders. So Della was sharing that when she asked her nominating committee to be intentional about racial diversity, the response that they gave back was, we don't know any Black or Hispanic people. And as someone who's new to the city, that was both shocking, but just sort of get your feedback on what is the role of chambers in developing that pipeline, and sort of what can chambers do to support some of that. And I would also say to build some of those relationships with minority leaders in the community so that they want to serve in a chamber leadership position.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is something that we're probably pretty late in Tulsa, but just before I was leaving, we had created what we were calling the C-level internship experience. C-level because we wanted more minorities and more people, and certainly more African Americans, to be able to see, right, the level of which they could rise in our city to CEO, to perhaps an owner. And so we have created an externship program where companies basically sponsor a spot, and we focused on tech and IT and in accounting. And we asked for companies to provide several slots for individuals to come in and learn and see, usually students between 16 and 18, to take that place. And so they can get an experience within your world. You're exposed to them, you get to know them. And then ultimately the hope was that after year one, where they've had this experience, that they would come back and serve as an actual intern for pay and really learn that industry, and hopefully become someone who you retain year after year, and ultimately to become employee. So that's a new program that is still sort of being developed, but that was sort of the pitch. I really structured it after the U.S. Chamber's Next Gen Business Partnership. That's an existing program that the U.S. Chamber has that really is about an orientation for people across difference, put it out there, ask for people to submit or nominate, and then start to build the talent. You can either grow your talent or steal your talent for our communities. I believe we need to grow them. And so creating something like that for even college students across difference, recruit at a HBCU, a historically Black college or university, to get people to come in and work in the industry and or even join your board. I assure you, I tell this to people in Tulsa all the time, I'm not the only Black person in Tulsa that can sit on your board. There are tons of other highly qualified individuals who can do this, who can serve what you want. And you just have to leverage me to help find them. So if you do have people across difference, ask them to dig into their networks. Who would be perfect? Who should we get? And then be just really genuine in the ask. We really want to do better. We really need some different perspective on this. Can you help me connect with someone across difference? We need them. I think that will go a long way into getting more people connected into your organization.
Great, thanks. So I see that Brianna has her hand up, and so I'm gonna ask her to unmute herself.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you for your presentation so far, Kuma. I feel like I've been following you around at some of the different presentations you've been doing. It's been really, really helpful. So my chamber is in a small rural community in California, but we have a very large Latinx population.
Yes.
And I've been working on engaging them, and I've spent the last probably 9 months just trying to sit on more committees where cultural diversity is discussed, and slowly I'm starting to build actual friendships with some people in our community that identify as Latinx. And so my question is, we're now, my chamber, when I first came in and they want to start working on this, just said, translate the newsletter into Spanish. So I went to the committee that I sit on and I mentioned this, and they're like, they're not going to read that, that's maybe not the best use of your time. So I'm just trying to figure out kind of how to engage a community that literally speaks a different language than most of our publications.
Yeah.
So I guess, how do you work with just the language barrier that can exist there?
Yeah, that was a great one. When we were at our chamber, I think we were like, okay, we've got this budding Latinx community. How do we engage them? And I think we all were just like, let's just translate everything into Spanish. That's just what we got to do. And I went to a really good friend. His name is Francisco Trevino. Francisco was the president of the Hispanic Chamber here in Tulsa. And I said, got this amazing idea. We're going to translate everything into Spanish. And he said, hey, I'm the president of the Hispanic Chamber, and I've never translated anything. Everything I do is in English. So why would you do that? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Exactly what you heard. It's not the best use of your time. But what he did say was that having an interpreter or someone present at meetings would be very helpful. And being consistent, showing up, supporting new businesses as they're opening, making yourself a staple in their community. It's about connection and relationship, and you're finding this, right? And it's a tight-knit group, and it's really a lot by word of mouth. And so anytime you can extend yourself to be connected to them, it's a whole PR job. It's really showing that you have relationship and frequenting their business, elevating their business, and they will start to come. They'll start to join your meetings. We have more and more Hispanic businesses joining our chamber, and we don't have to translate anything. Most of the time, English is great, but it is nice to acknowledge that they are across difference. And I've even had events where I've, made the topic something that would connect to them as business owners, or addressing immigration issues, or other things that like we can cross-pollinate and hopefully be a benefit to each other. So that's something to think about when you're trying to do more of that work. I love that your chamber is down and committed. It is just really challenging to break into that community. Similarly, in Tulsa, we have a really large Native population, and it's just kind of how they do business is that they operate with each other. And so the diversity conversation is a little bit reverse in that respect, in that I'm like, hi, I'm here talking about diversity. And they're like, no, we really want to hire our own. We really want to do business with other Native owned people. And so it's been a little bit interesting trying to showcase that they too can experience and demonstrate diversity. So I think that's a little bit of what we have a challenge with as well.
Thank you.
So I have our next question here is from Katie Brooks in the chat, and I'll just read it out. So thinking of chamber civic leadership programs, we've made efforts to recruit diverse candidates for our program, and I've been kindly warned that I need to do the work to ensure that the program itself is as culturally competent and inclusive before people of color will be willing or will be able to trust that it's a safe environment for their participation. Any suggestions about resources to thoughtfully address those concerns?
Oh, that is such a great one, right? I mean, how often do we go in, or I join some organization and it's very predominantly white group, right? And they're just experiences being shared, or assessments feel like they're from a perspective that I can't relate to. I'll tell you, I went to a meeting with a few different leaders, and we were talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. And the small talk before we got to the diversity, equity, inclusion was all about skiing. Like they had all like gotten a little vacation during the pandemic and had gone skiing somewhere or something like that. And I was just like, I can't relate. And sometimes we create programs, from a one lens, and we're not thinking about all the different perspectives and how that can be seen. In my mind, it would be create a small little feedback group and have them read through your curriculum, or to take a look at it and really add some critical feedback about ways that this maybe isn't worded right, or this doesn't resonate in my community, or I think that alone will go a long way to building trust, so that you can get indeed the participation. They'll get that kind of stamp. I had a say in this, right? They didn't just say they were coming to help me. They really wanted my input on how to make this better, and you'll get it. And you need to receive it well, and don't take it defensively, and then make the changes necessary so that people feel more included. And I think you can't do that enough. Be intentional about asking people for their feedback before you build a program. Get a full, diverse perspective on it. There might be leadership programs, Leadership Tulsa. There's Wendy Thomas here in Tulsa who's amazing. And she just a few years ago held a big diversity, not diversity conference, but a leadership conference here. So there might be other leadership organizations that would be a good resource to how their curriculum is sort of gone through a bias test or a check, just to make sure that it's aligning with more global or more culturally competent views. So that might be another resource to check out. There's also equitytools.com. It's amazing. I love it. Just visit Equity Tools, and there's just pages and pages of resources and potential assessments and articles and graphs and charts that can all help make this maybe a little more real and tangible for those of you who might still be kind of struggling about where to start.
Our next question is about can you provide some examples of what it looks like for a chamber website to sort of reflect commitment to DEI, or sort of what kind of content would be on a chamber website that would indicate that a chamber was really on this journey to equity?
Yeah, so a lot of times chambers have a great tagline. Ours was like, your partner in prosperity, or something like that. But I think what we added was our diversity statement much more prominently on the main page, that we embrace inclusive, something that really states something that you believe in, or your core value stated right up front, that really would showcase that you are very interested in diversity, equity, inclusion. Also having a page dedicated to it, resources, you can't go wrong with that. And just, that we are an open and welcoming and affirming employer. Those are some of the things that I would suggest would be important to see as you're looking at a website. Make sure your images are diverse. We had a women's luncheon one time, and it was like, come join us. And it was just two white women, having coffee, or whatever. And several of my friends were like, you want me to come to this, but it doesn't even look like something that I would be welcome at. So how are you projecting your organization visually to those who are visiting your website? I think would be really important. And no, I'm not saying that you have to go out and make every picture diverse, but I mean, if you don't have enough pictures in order to put and showcase your intentionality toward being more diverse, then there's probably some work to do about some relationship building you can do to start getting to that place where you can have those images and pictures to showcase. Don't go out and buy a bunch of stock photos of Black, Asian, and Native people, though. Make it real.
And then the last question I have so far is, we're talking a little bit about some leadership programs and things like that. Do you have any ideas specifically or examples of programs that help progress mid-level professionals into more senior roles? So thinking about that pipeline for senior leadership specifically.
Yeah, so I've been really looking at, and actually I'm on a sort of a discovery committee here in Tulsa for the African American Leadership Academy. And I believe it's out of Ohio at the AALA. So check that out. That is a program to develop that mid-level, very specific to African American leaders of color. But I think that model is something that would be fabulous. And so it's like a cohort model, so many weeks, intensive training, more about leveraging your influence, learning how to network properly. These are things that a lot of people of color, we're just, that is just not a part of how we grew up, right? I didn't really know how to network appropriately and leverage my networks appropriately until I started working in the chamber, and that's just been 10 years ago. So programs like that are key, and that's one that I would cite. We're probably going to try to replicate something like that here in Tulsa, and that is out of Ohio. And so a really great maybe model for something like that, building that mid-level leadership.
And could you repeat the name of that program one more time, Kuma?
Sure, it's the African American Leadership Academy, and it might be AALA.com, but it's, I think if you looked up African American Leadership Academy and put Ohio, it would show up.
Great.
Oh, there it goes. Someone popped it in there.
Wonderful. One thing I love about our members is how helpful you all are. So you dropping those in there and sharing them with your peers. We had a couple other questions that were specific to strategic planning and strategic plans. I'm going to ask us to just put a pin in those until next week, because I know you're going to cover a lot of that during next week's session.
Yep. We don't want to give it all away.
And then one other question, there was a book that you had mentioned earlier, the name of that book, if you remember.
I'm so sorry. I don't remember if I mentioned a book.
No problem.
I apologize. I'll have it next time. Join us again. I'm looking back at my notes. I'm sorry, I don't remember the book that I might have mentioned.
Great.
Oh, Awake to Woke to Work. That's absolutely it. And it's an article. It's by Pro Inspire. And it's a model that I just happened to find in terms of my research and looking around. And I felt like a lot of we'll talk about it much more in depth next week, but a lot of the concepts there seem to align with chamber and trying to figure out their own strategies. And so I just really have based a lot of the work that we've done in Tulsa on that model.
Great. Excellent. And there's a link to that article right here in the chat as well. Wonderful. Well, I don't have any other questions. And I know that no one is likely to be upset to have a few minutes back in their afternoon here. But before everyone jumps off, I really would like to thank Kuma for her excellent presentation. As always, if you have ever heard her present before, you will just understand why we've asked her to do this series and just so appreciate her leadership in this area. So thank you, Kuma. We look forward to having you all back here next Tuesday afternoon. Same time. If you haven't registered already, please make sure that you do so. And we look forward to continuing the conversation then.